you say the legitimacy of wrestling. Are you saying that from the move set, or are you saying that from the toughness of individuals? Like where does
No,
that
no.
sort of
Yeah, the move said 100%. Like, yeah, the whole like pro wrestling toughness. I don't care for that at all because I'll tell you what, 4 times a week I go into my local academy and I've got a bunch of black belts who are half my size, twice my age, and they're choking me to death. So there's no toughness in pro wrestling. I don't buy that for a second. But no, in the moves, in the fundamentals, I find, to be honest, whether people want to admit it or not, the fundamentals are the biggest things I feel are lacking in the current generation. At the risk of sounding like an old man, but it's the one big thing I see. I see a lot of positives. Like when I look at the people coming through for camps that we run, we're running camps every year, every half year. I've just noticed that there's been a lot of positives. Like a lot of people are coming through and they're a bit more savvy about the psychology of the business, how to structure matches, how to sell, things like that. I'm seeing a lot more knowledge of that. Whereas when I started 20 plus years ago, no one had a clue. Like we were never taught anything like that. We were taught your basic moves and how to break full, and that was it. And we just had to figure it out for ourselves. So I'm getting more of that side, but then I feel like the fundamentals are kind of lacking in a way. So that's where I'm trying to build things. I feel like that's going to help everything. Because I look at where I started. I know you look back on where you started and when you started. You always look on it with rose-colored glasses. You think it was amazing. Then you watch the footage and you go, "Yeah, that was a bit rough." But what I noticed was in Adelaide when I was training under Coldavani at the Monster Factory, the wrestlers coming through there, almost every single one of them, every single movement they did was crisp. They could do your basic moves.
I remember that
every time. They could break fall 100% every time.
I remember that.
That's where I feel like now it's a bit, some people just can't do it, and some people come in and they can do the moves and they can do the high spots, but I'll ask them to switch a hammerlock and they got no clue. So
why do you think that is? Why do you think that they've developed that way?
I think a lot of it just comes down to things have been given a free pass, perhaps. It's hard for me to judge because I hate when people generalize, on one little thing they may have seen and they generalize a whole industry or a whole scene, a whole state, a whole promotion. I hate that. So I'm never going to judge anywhere where I've never actually been through their doors and watched their training. But what I found just from my own kind of home base is that I feel like things get a little bit of a free pass. Things might not be perfect and it's kind of like, yeah, good enough. Let's move on. Let's learn the next thing. I know that when I started, if you didn't get it perfect 3 times in a row, you did it for the rest of training. There's the same move over and over and over. And if you didn't get it, you didn't get in the ring. We had to graduate from the mats at the start of every training, had to do every break full perfectly, had to do a series of chain wrestling holds perfectly. And until you could, you weren't allowed up in that ring. And I know that sounds harsh and old school, but it worked. And yeah, people probably got bored and left and never came back. But the ones that did stick around became very talented wrestlers, like your Jags and Havocs, like Jonah Rock. And they're the guys that ended up teaching a whole new generation. I feel like in some ways people have been given a free pass and it's too lenient. It's too, that's good enough.
But that was probably a way to weed people out by doing that and saying like who's willing to get to that stage. And it's like the people that fell off, it's like, when you hear stories of, 20, 30 years ago when people were training and, like, and it was a lot harder at all. Like they would physically try and break people to the point where they would want to quit. You know what I mean? So they would clean out like the weakest links or like not the weakest links, but the people who really wanted it, so to speak.
Yep. And when I first started Wrestle Rampage with Hartley Jackson, he started it, but I was there with him. And that was 2005. And we ran tryouts and they were like that. They were old school. They were, the first day was 6 hours. The second day was 3 to 4 hours. And in that time, it was just out in the park across the road doing just blow up drills and carrying people around a 400-meter park. And man, we had, people puking everywhere and people like leaving 10 minutes in because they couldn't handle it. And it's an old school approach. And the ones that made it through were very few and far between, but the ones that did make it through, most of them still around to this day and doing a fantastic job. And they learned very quickly because they had the heart to push through those difficult times. And that's just one mindset. I don't really subscribe to that mindset anymore. I'm very Switzerland. Like I'm very modern thinking with a bit of an old school flair. But hey, there's positives to both approaches. It just depends on where you want to take your company and what kind of feel you want from your training school.
Do you think the reason also too could be, now I'm just asking for your opinion here, that they watch a lot of the wrestling in this day and age? To me, a lot of these guys are a lot more advanced with advanced moves, bigger move set, and you don't see a lot of it on the TV, the basic holds and whatnot. Back in the 80s, almost every match used to see the same basic. Do you think it's because what they're watching, they just say, well, that's what they're doing, so we're going to do that too? Do you think that's the mindset as well at all? Or do you think it's, just tell me if it's rubbish or not? So,
no, I agree 100%. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I was an Attitude Era kid. Like I started watching in 99.
It's all punch and kicks and whatnot.
Yeah. Like the wrestling wasn't great. It was punch, kick, 2-minute match, and off you go. But for whatever reason, I went and sought out, like, I remember only a year or two into me being a fan of wrestling, I would go and hire like 10 weekly videos from Blockbuster, and I would get all the 80s and 90s stuff, like whatever I could find. And Bret Hart was my favorite wrestler. A lot of people wouldn't care for that because they're brought up they get into wrestling because of a certain style, a certain feel, and anything else kind of isn't what they see wrestling as. And I see that to this day. I have conversations with people and they just can't tolerate a Bret Hart match, and I think they're nuts. But
you know what?
It's true.
But like, it's like Dean Malenko as well, though. Like, I find, like, to me, like, I know he's really, really good, but I find him like so fucking boring to watch. Like, I can't, like, he's good, but like, I just can't get into Dean Malenko's matches.
Sure.
That's where like the Bret Harts and the Shawn Michaels come into it, because they add that extra element that he had. He had like 1,000 different moves, more. He had a higher repertoire than those guys. But, they had, a pretty good element, but also too, Shawn had a bit of high flying, spotty. Bret had a bit more old school sort of move set. So it was, and also too, they weren't that small. Dean was a pretty small guy. You know what I mean? So they're actually reasonably big in compared to, like, obviously weren't as big as like Hulk and whatnot. But I think they were, to me, I thought that they were like the perfect balance of both worlds. You know what I mean? As like a Kurt Angle, he's like the perfect balance of both worlds. So
sure.
I think it's important. I don't know. That's just my point of view. I said it's like monkey see, monkey do. They watch, what's going on, and that's what they want to do. Like, oh, we're going to start the match with a powerbomb. You go for it, bro. You know what I mean? Like, you go for it, because it's just, I don't know. I like.
I think personally, I think a lot of the wrestling over the past 5-10 years has been the best ever. Obviously, not all of them. I'm not generalizing. I'm just saying there are a lot of fantastic wrestlers at the moment. So, in that, they are the people coming up at the moment, the trainees coming up. They are seeing that and wanting to emulate that, but it's the whole running before you can walk. A lot of, let's say, for example, like your Okada, your Ospreay, those kinds of guys who are having these just incredibly beautifully told matches with incredible storytelling in ring, but they both came from backgrounds where they learned how to do it properly. They learned the fundamentals. Ospreay coming from the UK, Okada coming through the New Japan dojo. Yeah. That's not the same as a lot of the guys in this kind of situation on a local scene level who aren't getting that same foundation. So they're going out there trying to emulate this. They're trying to emulate like, you know, the highest of the high level stuff without having the underneath. And when the underneath isn't there, that stuff doesn't work. That's how I see it.
No, 100%. I mean,
whereas you're right. 80s wrestling, 90s wrestling, it was very, very similar. A lot of very similar moves and stories and holds and selling and that kind of thing. A little bit less complex, I think.